Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Ko April Mackenzie taku ingoa. Hello everyone, good morning. Thank you for joining us. I'm April Mackenzie. I'm the Chief Executive of the External Reporting Board, and we are joined by a great panel today and a good number of participants to discuss ethics, independence in the context of sustainability assurance, navigating the future. This is going to be a conversational webinar, and there will be an opportunity for you to participate by presenting questions. We've got Karen Tipper here, the Technical Director in the Assurance team, who will be keeping an eye on questions. And we've got Misha Peters, the Director of the Audit and Assurance Standards team at the XRB, who is going to play lead tag with me, and they never let me out alone. Then I'm also joined by Marge Russ, the chair of the NZAUASB. Marge is also a director of Tonkin Taylor and senior resource management specialist. Marge is qualified environmental planner and senior environmental auditor. So Marge has undertaken all sorts of regulatory certification and consulting roles all around New Zealand, considering and Australia and in the UK. She's worked in regional and state government water resource management as well as environmental management certification, but she knows heaps about auditing and assurance standards and independence and ethical standards, as she's been with the NZAUASB for some years. We've also got Vasana. Vasana, your surname's dropped off. Oh, here we go. Vasana Van Parasuath, who is an audit partner from PwC and is a member of the NZAUASB. Vasana provides audit and assurance services specialising in financial services sector, including insurance, asset management, funds, superannuation, real estate and finance companies. So we know there's lots of challenges there when it comes to sustainability reporting, and more specifically at the moment, climate-related disclosures. I'd like now to introduce a very special guest, Mark Babington. Mark has joined us here in New Zealand. Even though this webinar is virtual, Mark is actually currently sitting up in Auckland. Mark, a huge thank you to you for travelling out to New Zealand and participating in several events this week. Mark is a member of the International Ethics Standards Board for Accountants. We nickname it IESBA, and he's been on that board since January 2022. But Mark also leads for IESBA the Task Force on Independence for Sustainability Working Group that's looking at the independence and ethics rules around for assurance practitioners when reporting on assurance sustainability reports. So he's an expert for us to talk with today. But in his day job, Mark is the Executive Director of Regulatory Standards at the Financial Reporting Council in the UK. So a special thanks to you, Mark, for joining us as we here in New Zealand tackle this interesting topic. We are right in the thick of it at the moment as people have mandatory climate reporting and mandatory assurance kicking in soon over the greenhouse gas emissions. So I'm sure that the participants, we're up to 97 now and still climbing, so that's exciting, are already aware that here in New Zealand, the External Reporting Board issued a temporary standard that covers the assurance engagement over the mandatory greenhouse gas emissions disclosures when reporting under using New Zealand climate standards. When it came to the ethics and independence issues, we took a very principled approach, a very high-level approach, and invited people to comply with standards that were set out more at the principles-based not the detail-based. And that's been an interesting approach. As we know, the independence rules for accountants are relatively detailed. Misha might be able to tell me how many pages they run to. So we took a slightly different approach, as was a new regime. And certainly the External Reporting Board wanted to make sure that it didn't create any unnecessary barriers to entry into this market. We don't want a market of cowboys, and we're not suggesting there is or that there was going to be, but we put some principles in place around the performance of this engagement, including independence and ethics, and that's what we're going to burrow into today. Misha, before I kick off and start and ask Mark the first question, is there anything further in background that you want to mention for the audience to set the scene?
No, April, you've covered all my key points, so nothing to add there.
Oh, that's a good. I've passed my first test. So, Mark, let's get you to kick off, because you've got this eye on the international. Well, we've got an eye on the international scene, but you're in it. I was going to say up to your knees, but probably up to here. Mark, can you provide us with some context for why IESBA is doing the work that it's doing, and what your key expectations are around what we can expect to be coming out of IESBA in relation to the independence around sustainability assurance?
Yeah, I'm very happy to, April, and you know, really good to be able to join you and your members and your stakeholders today. So we had a rocket set under us at COP26 when an announcement was made that an international sustainability standards board would be set up to drive high quality, consistent reporting of climate and indeed other sustainability material. But you can't just have a reporting standard. It needs to have a framework for reporting, including an assurance framework, and that needs high quality, ethical and independent standards. And therefore, IESBA's board decided that it would respond to the call of international regulators, and it would look to develop our code of ethics so that it was fit for purpose for sustainability reporting engagements and sustainability assurance engagements. Now, the biggest challenge we face is that a lot of the sustainability reporting engagements kick in at the end of 2024 in many jurisdictions. So for those of you familiar with the standard setting world, it's pretty slow. And we've had to work really quickly. And where we are now is that in December, I very much hope the IESBA board will approve a consultation for issue, and we'll be reaching out to stakeholders next year. We hope to issue it in January for a period of 3 to 4 months, and get some feedback about what we've done. Now, the other challenge I just want to sort of leave you with is that in the world of sustainability, it's not just accountants and auditors who are carrying out the work. So therefore, if we're going to have a code that's relevant, and if it's going to meet the needs that that really are set for it, we've got to have something that is useful not only for accountants and auditors, but a diverse range of other professionals who are carrying out sustainability reporting and sustainability assurance. So therefore, what IESBA's done is leverage the code and develop it so that there's a sustainability section which has been built in a profession agnostic way. So regardless of who you are and what you do, if you're in the sustainability world, we hope you'll be able to use it to underpin your work with high quality independence and ethical requirements.
Thank you very much for that overview. What I want to do is pause here and remind people that they can write their questions and answers. Karen, do you want them in the chat or in the Q&A section?
In the Q&A section, please. In
the Q&A section. I invite you to write those as you go, and then I invite Karen for you to leap in if you think it's really makes for a better flow, that people's questions are answered on the spot. We're going to hand over to Marge to get some reflection on whether this is really the same as financial statement independence, whether it's needed in that same extent. You know, I think that the lie of the land, I think we need to acknowledge that the extent of mandatory sustainability reporting is still some way off. And I think that even it could be long before 2024. There's definitely a climate first approach, which is what we've done in New Zealand. And I've been speaking with many jurisdictions who are also looking at a climate first approach. Europe, of course, has taken a much broader base. And then in other jurisdictions all around the world, it's not clear yet whether they're going to be going GRI standards, ISSB standards, and the extent to which those are mandatory. But I very quickly get out over my depth, so I'm going to hand over to Misha for the running, but stay closely attentive and stir the pot along the way. Misha, you want to pick it up with the questions, and I think the next one's going to Marge.
Perfect, thank you, April, and that's stir away. It's good to get the conversation going. So yeah, a key sort of aspect that I understand that the ASB is working through is on the basis that the independence requirements for the financial statement should be equivalent to the independence requirements for the sustainability assurance engagements. So I've got that right. That's good. Thank you, Mark. So yeah, the idea, Marge, is just to sort of get your thoughts on this premise. Is whether that, you know, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I think there's definitely pretty wide agreement that the principles around independence and the threats to independence pretty universally held across those practitioners who are doing credible assurance. We looked at that when we were developing our climate standard for assurance of greenhouse gas reporting, and established pretty quickly that these principle level things are pretty clear. And so I think, yes, they should be the same. The question really comes at the level of detail. So certainly the ethical code that's developed for accountants over many years has built out many more specific requirements to deal with particular issues that have arisen. And a lot of that detail less appropriate, and there will be other issues that are more important to be addressed over time as we look broader than something defined and constrained within, say, what are financial reports and financial reporting standards require to be done. So absolutely at the principle level, but I think we have to be very careful about not introducing a whole lot of very detailed and prescriptive requirements that have developed over time in a different context.
Fasana, any thoughts from you and any sort of challenges from the practical side of things as to, is it all the same or is there differences?
Thank you, Marge. Kia ora. So I'm probably a bit biased in my views, given my profession. So this is the code of ethics that I apply as a professional. So yes, agree with Marge that they certainly should be the same, and because it is because they are principles-based standards. And so whether, it should be applicable across all assurance providers, no matter what you're giving assurance on, and to some extent really doing that with Part 4B, right, with the non-financial information engagements. And it goes back to the basic principle. Simply, as an assurance practitioner, we need to be free from biases and undue influences as much as possible. But the complexities which already exists for financial statement independence, I think is even more enhanced with sustainability assurance. And there will always be areas of the principles that will need really critical thinking and really sound professional judgment. At the end of the day, we all want to do the right thing. So I'll probably just touch on a few points around the two, I don't know what you call it, two pillars of independence of mind. And in my view, I've always found it's probably a little bit easier, but then on reflection, is it really easier, right? Because the topic of ethics and independence is so emotive, with biases, blind spots, and dare I say it, naivety and arrogance that are in play. it's a real challenge. And then when you get into independence and appearance, where what a third party might think, what a shareholder, so someone you don't know what their ethical and their values are, will have almost a completely different view to you. So those are some of the challenges that already exist, but I think they will be enhanced when you get to the broader topic of non-financial information and particularly sustainability. The other point I wanted to make was around sort of leading from Marge's comments around the more rules-based aspects, particularly that come through in part 4. And some of those nuances around independence of the firm, how you consider parts of the client's group, financial interests, etc. So part 4 captures all this. How far? My question would be, how far does part 5 go? So I know the concept of the value chain. Mark and your team at AESWA are looking at this, so maybe I'll ask you to comment around that.
So it's a good question to ask, because I suppose it's one of the biggest challenges in a sense that sustainability reporting does include reporting across the value chain. And one of the challenges is that you have this information that is provided by a myriad of different suppliers that an entity may engage with. And it's entirely possible that the numbers you end up reporting for your value chain are bigger than those for the entity. So when you're thinking about the provision of information that is reliable and that people can trust and used for decision making, it's really important that they can also feel confident about the value chain. So we need to have a way of ensuring that there's appropriate ethical and independence protections there. But we can't craft it in a way that makes it impossible for anyone to do that work. Because if you said everyone has to be independent from everything in the value chain, it wouldn't just be in New Zealand that you wouldn't have an auditor able to do that or a provider able to do it. You wouldn't have it anywhere. And so therefore, what we've had to do is make sure that we think about the value chain in a proportionate way, about the threats that it poses to the information as a whole, and design our approach accordingly.
Am I allowed to chip in here? So,
Yeah.
have we just contradicted ourselves though, Mark, about how it's the same level of independence and assurance as financial statements, but financial statements don't have the value chain prospect? So, are we required to be independent from the value chain? Which I agree with you, the numbers could be huge, and you could have could be your own organisation or a related organisation that is a key supplier. So how does that relate across to the financial statement independence?
So what we've done, and I think this is quite a sort of neat trick, is that the value chain is there providing information to an entity to support its sustainability reporting. And what we're going to consult on is a proposal around the value chain that says you have to think about independence if you know or have reason to believe that your independence could be compromised. So, for instance, is there an element in your value chain that is so significant to the reporting that your entity makes that if you weren't independent, it would perhaps undermine the credibility and integrity of your reporting? So what we're actually doing is saying there's not a sort of default that everyone has to be independent, but there is a trigger to say, is there something here that's so significant that it would undermine my independence and it would undermine the credibility of what's reported?
Great. There's a question in here that I'm going to hand over. I'm going to play Karen because I can. Marge, it says a question here for you. I hope you've read it. It says, can you give some examples of the details or complexities within the IESBA code that are not relevant to sustainability engagements because they come from a more financial background? Ooh, so that was good. Someone was listening very carefully to you, and they'd like to have something done.
Absolutely. Well, one of the things is that the board took a decision very early on that it's important that we're equivalent. So, you know, the requirements that sit on auditors and accountants, you know, if you want a level playing field, we want the same levels of independence applying to other professionals as well. But, you know, in other professions, they might not, for instance, have been used to the fact that you're expected to be financially independent of an entity that you're engaging with. So you can't own shares in it. You can't, you know, you don't have a financial influence in it. And some people might say, well, is that relevant in the context of sustainability? It is. Similarly, in an audit, there are protections in the code that an individual doesn't work for too long on that engagement, because you might build up a relationship that undermines your ability to challenge or your integrity. And so therefore auditors rotate. That requirement will go on to other sustainability practitioners who perhaps may have very long established relationships with entities that they provide services for. But if we're going to have that equivalence, and, you know, sort of close to home for me, it's there in EU law, for instance, for the CSRD, then we need to make sure that we're treating all parties equally.
Mm-hmm. So, Marge, have you got any reaction or reflections on that?
Yeah, I think there's you know, we need to recognise this as a still developing field, and the connection between very mature assurance processes have been in place for decades, supporting supply chains, and we'll come back to that a bit later, I think. You know, there is such a wide range of particular subject matter and to be involved, and so the ability to have enough professionals to do the assurance, to allow a rotation at the sort of rate at which can happen within a very big and established market like financial auditing is challenging. So we hear already that, you know, there aren't enough auditors, financial auditors. There's a struggle for them. Given you probably need auditors with very specialist subject matter information to do sustainability, you're really going to be struggling to be rotating at the sort of expectations that are being developed for particularly public interest entities in the framework. And you know, we still have stories, even though we've got these principles of financial auditors have been doing the engagement for 20 years. So we need a time frame to think about when some of the detail about how long to be on an audit program, how long you need to stand down, cool down, when you can come back, that we need a great deal of realism in thinking about that, and not sacrificing the importance of competence to do the audit by saying, well, we need to rotate the auditor, but actually there's no one else with the right competence at the moment to do that. So there's some really practical issues. And, you know, I always balance very strongly. To me, competence is equally or perhaps even more important over sustainability matters than the independence issue. Certainly, when you think about the kind of roles, information that might be reported and being assured, people are interested in the subject performance, and very keen, if you're in the medical profession, that was the brain surgeon having a look at this rather than the GP.
I think you make some really valid points there, Marge, and I suspect there's been lots of debate around that at the IESB table too, because even in the financial reporting space, Mark was kindly sharing with us about an experience they were having in the UK about the depth of competence in the UK audit market in order to allow rotation, or to allow where an auditor chooses not to keep a client, maybe because of a risk assessment or some other issue. Is there another competent auditor in the market that isn't otherwise already conflicted through other advice or other relationships? So that's a really important point you make, and about the fact that, is it appropriate to place an extremely mature, long developed system on an emerging field? Now, sustainability reporting and sustainability has been there a long time, but not in this context of the securities markets and in the general purpose financial reporting space, where it's going to be subject to a different type of reporting expectation, different consideration of the quality of that information and the associated assurance. So I think it's a really important and big challenge. Misha, I said I was going to hand over to you, and then I've
No, that's what I
But are you
thought
going to
would
do
happen.
are you going to do a poll? Is that what you're going to do next?
That's what we thought. So we'll launch that now and get your views as to whether you think the independence requirements should be the same for financial statement audits and for sustainability assurance engagements. Lots of people voting, so we'll leave it running for a couple of seconds.
And there's some questions you might want to look at, see whether they...
Yeah, there's an interesting question here, actually, Mark. Can you give an example of what would be a material threat to independence within the value chain for a sustainability assurance engagement? Most professional audit firms have well embedded independence requirements and processes, and is this value chain consideration overcomplicating things?
Well, you asked for an example. I think a really good one would be, say, if you're looking at your value chain reporting, obviously value chain reporting, if you use international frameworks, are driven by what's material in that value chain. What happens if you're looking at the information you're reporting and 95% of it comes from one entity? And what happens if your provider or assurer of your sustainability assurance engagement is independent of the client, but happens to have a significant financial interest in the entity that 95% of your numbers come from? So you'd actually say, well, doesn't that undermine the integrity and the independence of the person providing, that assurance service? And shouldn't we protect that in some way? Because, there might be a particular pressure on them, or there might be influence on them to ensure that something is reported in a particular way that gives a favourable outcome. So that's the sort of thing we think about, and we want to do this in a proportionate way. So, that means that we're only doing it in the most significant cases, know or have reason to believe, and not in every case.
Thanks, Mark. So thank you also for everybody for voting. We'll share the results of that poll now. So it seems like a majority believe that yes, it should be, but there's almost a quarter that think maybe. So there's the sort of challenge in that space. So good things to think about. I've also seen a question here coming through, Mark, about what is the biggest challenge that the ASBA's faced in preparing this exposure draft? So is it the value chain? Is it the equivalence? Or what from your perspective, do you think has been the biggest challenge?
Well, I think the biggest challenge is that we recognise that, this part of the code that we're writing for use by, a broader population of professionals. And the code is a complex document, but accountants and auditors use it every day, and therefore, have been working with it for a long time. But actually, we'll be dealing with new professions who haven't been exposed to it, and we need to make sure that it's there in a sort of standalone part of the code and that it's accessible. So we recognise the fact, for instance, that we're going to have to provide guidance to help with its application and implementation. And also, I'm very aware of some of the things that are in the code. Big audit firms, global audit firms, have taken a period of years to implement some of these things. So we can't just set a new requirement and say overnight, you've all got to be able to do this. We've got to be able to, allow an appropriate run-in time to make sure that, everyone is able to do this in a way that is probably going to underpin public confidence in the information that's reported and assured.
And so asking a question that just possibly everyone else knows, how long is an appropriate run-in time?
Well, it depends how difficult the thing that you're asking of them. But like a good example,
But the
April.
IESBA hasn't indicated is it indicating in its proposal?
Well, I'm pretty sure that we will be asking in the consultation what the effective date should be. But a really good example is in ISSA 5000, which is the IAASB's assurance standard. It talks about the need for there to be an appropriate quality management standard. Audit firms have had 2 years to develop their quality management procedures. So, you know, it would be slightly unfair if I turned around to Marge and told her that she'd got 3 weeks.
Yes, but isn't that 2 years on top of a previously existing quality management? And it's
It
not
is.
to suggest that the other assurance practitioners in other professions don't have quality management. They probably absolutely do. I mean, they're highly regarded professionals, whether they be engineers or resource management specialists, and do they have to be a profession? You know, what if you're I'm probably going off track. I'm going to get into trouble with Misha. You know, what if you don't have a profession, but you're a highly qualified specialist, years of experience, highly regarded in the market for that expertise, highly recognized, you know, as a specialist, and but you're not technically a professional because you don't belong to another body. Am I in or am I out? Am I going to be excluded?
Well, this is not about excluding people. This is about including people because we recognise the diversity of the professions, or indeed the individuals that do this work. But one of the things that's perhaps unusual and quite exciting about this work is that we want to be able to turn to other professions or other individuals and say, you know, this is what the requirement is to have a quality management approach. You might already be using a quality management approach in your day-to-day work. So are you able to demonstrate that you've got a high quality approach to quality management already in place, and that meets the requirement? So we're going to have to think about things, you know, in a different way. And that's, you know, we're open to that, but it means that sometimes you're looking for solutions to problems that you may need to learn a lot more about yourself in order to frame the solution.
Mm-hmm.
It's a great segue, Mark, into the next question, which was really how is the IESBA going about developing this profession agnostic code? So
a number of people may remember, and I know, for instance, Misha, that you and Karen and Marge were there, but we held a series of global roundtables before we even put pen to paper to say, well, we need to do something about sustainability. Come tell us what you think. And actually, we went away from those roundtables, I think, with a much better understanding of some of the problems and challenges that we needed to take account of. So before we even started writing, we knew, for instance, that the value chain was going to be a really complex challenge. And therefore, we've been able to do our development and we've been able to do our drafting to take account of that. We also have a reference group of a diverse range of practitioners. You know, it does include people from the accountancy profession, but it does include people from broader sustainability professions as well. And they've been enormously helpful. We've been able to ask them targeted questions, and we've also been able to say, in your practice, how does it actually happen? So that's been a really good test. And then, of course, we'll put out our consultation, and then we'll have to do more outreach. So in the first half of next year, we may well be returning to knock on your door and say, you know, you've got the document now, tell us what you think about it. And of course, it's not going to be just the independence, which of course is my main consideration, but there's also changes to the ethical standards as well. And there's also our project about the use of experts that also needs to be folded in, because we recognise that there's a very different group of experts with very different skills and very different backgrounds that are very active in the sustainability space.
Thanks, Mark. The other key thing that we are hearing and people keep asking us about is mapping between all these different requirements. So I understand there is some activity happening internationally to try and map between the various requirements?
So we are actually working closely with the International Accreditation Forum, which is an international umbrella body for the accreditation service providers in each jurisdiction. And one of the things that they have been doing working with us is to say, well, these are our independence requirements, these are our professional requirements. How do they map across to the code? And therefore, can we demonstrate that if we follow this approach in our country, does that meet the requirement of the code? And it's been really good because it's given a new sort of perspective to that. You know, these are people who are doing sustainability related work day in, day out. They have a long established approach and culture and professional sort of mindset. So the fact that we can better understand that and demonstrate how they meet requirements is a really powerful piece.
It's an interesting use of the word requirements, isn't it? Because the IESMA code is entirely, it only applies to accountants. It actually doesn't apply to anybody else legally, unless a jurisdiction determines, you know, so there's a lot of unknowns, isn't there, yet still. Misha, before you ask the next question, I see that someone has asked what's a value chain, and we have used that term quite a lot and we didn't explain it. So in the context of sustainability reporting, or in specifically in New Zealand with the mandatory climate statement requirements, when you're producing your climate statements under the New Zealand climate standards, it requires you to disclose information about your value chain. So I go like that because the entity's in the middle. And so you have to look at the greenhouse gas emissions, exposure to climate risks and opportunities, all the way through your supply chain. So all the way through where you get your inputs, for want of a better term, into what you produce, whether it's a good or a service. So your supply chain, whether you're sourcing material for your product from Malaysia or Chile or the UK, you know, you've got to look at what their greenhouse gas emissions are for the piece of and what their risks to climate and that supply chain coming in. And then also you need to follow your product out the other end. So where does my product go? How long does it get used for? How does it get disposed of? And therefore, what are its greenhouse gas emissions and other issues out the other side? So that whole bit going in both directions is the value chain. So I'll back to you, Misha.
I see there's another question. So before we keep going, I thought this would be a good time. So question is, what is the best way for a small-sized practice to comply with the requirements? Independence and upholding business ethics is at the utmost importance, yet compliance at best practice level comes at a great cost.
Yeah, and I think that is something that we are acutely aware of, and that's why the board is going to develop guidance that sits alongside the code. So, you know, it's particularly important that we are able to help those small practitioners who are not accountants to understand how they can meet the requirements in the code in a proportionate way that is not going to completely undermine their business model. So, you know, that is a major consideration for us. And you know, like as sort of April pointed out, auditors and accountants are required to use the code. It may be that in future there are more legal or regulatory requirements for other sustainability providers to have in place similar arrangements. But we need to make sure that in order to make that possible, you're not sort of breaking the model in order to get people to use a code. We want people to be able to say, this is something that supports our integrity as a business, and this is something that is going to underpin trust in the information that we report and assure. And therefore, it should be a positive thing and not seen as a burden.
Thanks. Yeah. So the next thing we wanted to sort of dig into is around the structure. So my understanding is that the AISP is actually developing a part 5. So for those of you who are familiar with the code, you'll understand that. For those of you who are not, it's sort of a separate section at the end of an existing document. And the logical rationale behind that is that building a part 5 is part of the code, but it's also standalone, so that those who are new to the regime just comply with part 5, but those who are familiar with the rest of it, it's an add-on. So I'll first ask Mark if I described that correctly, and if you've got any perspectives to add, and then maybe I can pass to Vasana about how you think that part 5 will work for a practitioner.
That was a great description, Misha, and you know, I sort of look at it very much as a sort of one-stop shop for sustainability practitioners.
Yeah, so then Vasana, how do you feel about that? Do you think that will work coming from a perspective of somebody who's really familiar with the code? What do you think about a part 5 attached?
Yeah, I don't want to jump to conclusions until I see part 5. And it kind of links back to the earlier questions around how far it will go, around, you know, these aspects of the value chain that you talk about, Mark. And you know, when you first look at it, I do see the real challenge is that a level playing field. So I think the fact that you're doing all this mapping, I think, you know, gives me some comfort that, you know, when you get to that position, that you will attempting to create this level playing field. But then I also question if you can do that, but then also achieve the objective of it being profession agnostic and workable, will be a great achievement indeed. Because when I think about parts 1 to 4, right, that apply to accounting professionals, it needs parts 1 to 3. And April, you mentioned pages of the code earlier. So just the New Zealand PES 3, which is just for assurance practitioners, is 261 pages long in its printed form. And Mark, I think I asked you this question the other day. How long was part 5? And you gave me a rough number of 200. So in my mind now, as an accountant professional, if I was to do this work, I've got now 400 pages of code to work through. And you've highlighted its complexity. We've talked about the challenges of, you know, how do you comply? There's one thing about, you know, the premise behind the principles, but then the best practice and having the systems that support it. And as you say, you know, all of us have had a long time to develop our underlying quality management systems to make sure we can get it right. So yes, I'm really, really looking forward to seeing sort of the great, and I'm sure really, really hard mahi of AISPA, but very keen to really understand what those additional add-ons, if they are termed add-ons, and what aspects is going to be very specific to sustainability assurance, so we can see the wood for the trees. I think once we you know, get part 5 and really understand as you know, what elements, you know, it won't actually change anything that we do. These are the things that you should be focusing on. So we'll obviously make it work, but see the challenges.
And the thing is, I suppose I could just say that you know, I recognise the challenge, but the thing is, I do think having a single section that's a one-stop shop for sustainability providers, even if it is long, is better than having requirements sort of scattered throughout the code. And, you know, if we get 200 pages, that is a significant amount of text. But you have to remember that the existing code is well over 300 pages. So the fact that we've actually managed to distill down all of the requirements for sustainability providers into something that's less than 2/3 of the code is actually quite a good trimming exercise. But I sit here between meetings in New Zealand with my blue pen scratching things out to try and reduce the word count and the page length for you.
To come back to the importance of this link up with International Accreditation Forum. So, you know, there is already well-established processes, quality management systems, ethical requirements that have been in place and are particularly important to supply chains. So the work of these accreditation bodies, accrediting testing laboratories, inspection bodies, certification bodies, is all driven by supporting supply chains and making streamlined processes to get confidence about tested reports, testing information, inspection information, products, services, and they are, they've got hundreds of pages of documents as well supporting that, and they have a whole auditing process. So the accreditation bodies operate with a number of standards issued by ISO, and they audit the testing laboratories, inspection services, the certification bodies, who also have another lot of standards they're operating to. It's quite hard to just pinpoint where the specific ethical requirements are within that, but they're there, very strongly there, because independent testing is really important in order to say you can trust this when you send this product from New Zealand to the UK without having to retest it. We're confident about the testing regime being competent in the first place and also independent. So there's a really good link up here to provide access to the experience over many, many decades from this existing regime and how it deals with competence and independence. And so this mapping and link is really good. But also it's important to understand that the professions, this sustainability world is developing new specialist knowledge and expertise all the time. So the engineering profession, for example, will have people who've been working in very established concepts of building safety and all those sort of things for many years. And those engineers, and some different engineers, are moving into other areas, not yet quite captured and identified independently within those professions. And there are new professions forming. So we've got new kind of professional groupings around environmental management and social impact, and this is all emerging, and these professionals are a small group working on the very leading edge of how do we think about these issues. So we need to be able to accommodate that as well, and I think Mark described some ways of thinking about that as well, and how do you identify what an expert is. It isn't just an engineer, it's probably going to be someone who has the baseline qualifications of an engineer or a scientist, and has built on this, years of practical experience to see how this works. And the other really important thing here is understanding that the material we'll be talking about will be wide context. So as April pointed out, your supply chain might be in Malaysia or Chile, your use of your product might be in Australia or the UK. The process for dealing with it as it's at the end of its life may involve some kind of recycling, and we've probably all understood the issues we've had with plastics in New Zealand, and markets being closed off for us to deal with and recycle products by sending plastic material offshore. These are quite complex issues, and they're fast moving. So we need to be very fleet-footed in understanding what's the right expertise. We need an assurance engagement to understand what's actually going on in this value chain. Where's it happening? What are the important issues in the locations it's happening? So that sort of subject matter and also context experience and knowledge is important too. So I'm really delighted that that IASP has been doing that engagement, that mapping started, because I would describe all these people out there in this other world, they're your friends. They're the people who are going to provide the reliable evidence, independent, reliable evidence in your supply and value chain. So I applaud it.
Well, that sounds like a perfect segue into your next poll, Misha, or Karen, whoever's going to lead that one off.
I was about to do that. So yes, our next question in our poll is really, what do you think about having this separate standalone part of the code? Do you think that's going to be profession agnostic?
And Misha, while people are pondering how they're going to vote, I'm put out because I'm not allowed to vote. There's an interesting question there in the questions about is there going to be any planned regulation monitoring of the independence requirements for sustainable assurers and ensuring that practitioners who sign off an engagement are appropriately qualified. So do you just want to give a little snapshot of what your understanding of where New Zealand's regulatory environment is at, while I'm assuming that our clever audience can fill in the questionnaire and listen to you at the same time.
No, that's good. So if we go back in time a little bit, in terms of our climate reporting regime in New Zealand, the government had, MB and MFE had a consultation document out in February proposing a sort of an oversight regime for greenhouse gas assurance practitioners. That we have not yet heard anything about. So we're still in a bit of a limbo as to if and how there's going to be oversight over the assurance practitioner doing that work. What we've built into our principle-based standards is really this point that we've been saying all day, is it needs to be both competent and independent practitioner. But, you know, the XRB is not the policeman. We've set the rules, and at the moment there is not a policeman. It's a self-assessment kind of regime. So we're hoping that everyone is wanting to do the right thing. But let's wait and see if and how a sort of enforcement and oversight regime gets introduced. I don't know, Mark, if there's a different context happening in the UK that might give us some indications of another way.
I expect we will be going through the same considerations, Misha, because if I look in the UK, about half of this work is done by auditors and accountants, and about half of it's done by other professionals. So, you know, if we're going to properly underpin confidence in their work and the information that's reported and assured, we can't have half the market subject to a regulatory regime and half the market not, because unfortunately the users of this information will assume that if there are standards, everyone's following them, and if something goes wrong, regulators or governments are able to take action. So, you know, as you say, it's not the XRB's job, but we all involved in the standard setting world need to raise awareness of the fact that we need an appropriate and effective regulatory regime.
And I will just note that
sorry, Marge. I suspect in the intervening period, though, it'll come down to the role of the professional bodies. So we'll be regulated as accountants. Marge, you talk about all the regulations around sort of the engineering profession. So I think to some extent that's already there, and we'll have to apply with this code and the relevant sustainability reporting standards in the same way we apply with the code now.
And certainly professions like the engineering have got to turn their mind to how the stuff they do that is requiring independent assurance activities, which they would call peer review, in a number of ways they'd think of that. How does that fit this particular approach and context? But I also point out that a lot of the work of accreditation bodies internationally is called up and required as part of regulatory processes. So, for example, in New Zealand, building certifiers and councils who are doing certification of building approvals are accredited by IANZ to do that task. And you might have heard the press when their accreditation was removed in Christchurch for a period because their processes and systems weren't up to the standard required to maintain that. So there are models, extensive models internationally and in New Zealand. There are other examples of where this regime is called up to be part of the regulatory operation. So we're yet to see whether that becomes part of the picture. So in New Zealand, the context here has been for 20 years, we've had an accredited certifier on greenhouse gas measurement and reporting and management. So, you know, obviously there's some things to work through, but there are other models that might be helpful here.
So maybe we can share the results of the poll. So it's a very evenly mixed bag, and I think there's many in the your camp, Basana. Let's maybe wait and see what it looks like before we can make that decision. I note we do have
not so even, Misha, when you add the no's and the maybes together, you know, I don't think we want to ignore the no's, even though it's 9%. So that's an interesting challenge, but maybe it'll become.
I was adding the yeses and the maybes together, April.
Oh no. But anyway, I think what it tells us is that is it what the saying is? The proof of the pudding is in the eating. So we look forward to next year's release? Can you just let us have our Christmas and summer holidays and then release it when we get back to work? Over to you, Misha.
So we do probably have time for one more question, Karen. I don't know if there's any particular one that you think we should pose.
There was one about experts, which I thought might be good to clarify. So will the independence requirements for experts used by the assurance practitioners be considered in the new code, or will it be the same as in the current code?
So we will leverage the approach in the current code, and it will, of course, depend on whether or not your expert is a member of the engagement team, a resource from within your firm, or whether or not it's an external expert, and how that operates. But we are leveraging the approach in the code. We're just recognizing that there is a broader population of experts in sustainability type engagements, and not all of those sustainability experts will come from a background that has, a recognized structured profession. It may just be that they are experts as a result of long involvement and building up expertise, and recognized for a particularly, complex and interesting aspect of sustainability reporting.
Misha, I wonder, just before we wrap up, whether Marge or Vasana have any last comment, other than I'd just like to finish off with a comment about the XRB's role. So Marge or Vasana, any final comment?
I think we've enjoyed this interaction with Mark over this week. It's been really good to get a bit of an insight to what we might see in February. Certainly, we've enjoyed the engagement that began before pens were picked up from IESPA, and are hopeful and quite expecting that we'll see something in February that is more likely than not to be seen to be helpful and appropriate, and if anything require tweaking rather than any kind of major rethought. So I'm pretty positive and hopeful, and I've been very reassured with this time we've been had with Mark over this last week.
Vasana.
So probably just to reiterate what Marge said, look, agreed. So it's been great to have you here, Mark, to really take us through the thinking that has gone behind where you've got to. Excited to get this New Year's gift of a new Part 5 to our code that we'll be working through in FY20 and in 2024. The proof will be in the pudding, as April said. The devil will be in the detail. So the fun has yet to start.
I would just like to wrap up with reminding the audience, and indeed ourselves, that the External Reporting Board is an independent standard setter. The current regime that we have in New Zealand around mandatory assurance over greenhouse gas emissions disclosures, which kicks in next year. Kicks in next year, is entirely practitioner agnostic. It does not stipulate who is required to undertake the work. The only stipulated requirement is that the work is undertaken in accordance with standards set by the External Reporting Board. And at this stage, the standard requires you to be independent and competent, and one or two other little quirks, but basically it's very, very high level and very high level principled. So there's a big challenge here for the External Reporting Board to ensure that it protects that it honours the legislation, and the fact that the New Zealand government has chosen that this is not yet, or may never be, a regulated part of the market. And so we must be open to all competent and independent providers who follow our standards. So that's a big challenge for us, remembering that the fine work of the IESPA doesn't necessarily how good it is, or their intention is that it has come from the accounting profession. And therefore, we have to challenge ourselves as a standard setter, is it fit for purpose for a broader base of practitioners? So I just want to assure and horrify, no doubt, the audience that we will be taking that challenge very seriously about ensuring that we honour the legislation and the current state of that legislation, what the New Zealand government has chosen not to identify or limit in any way or regulate who can undertake the work. So thank you very much, Mark, for travelling to New Zealand. It's been a great week. Thank you to Marge and Vasana for participating. A special thanks to Misha and Karen for all the organisation that's gone into not only this session, but the other sessions and roundtables that you've had. The External Reporting Board thanks you very much for attending, and also thanks very much, looks forward to having an ongoing strong relationship with you, Mark, wearing your UK hat and also your IESPA hat. Thank you very much.